Hello, hello, and welcome. I'm AJ O'Neill, the author of Greenlock Express, Greenlock, and Acme.js. And this is going to be kind of an ideological migration guide. So we're going to talk about the difference between Greenlock v2 and Greenlock v4 and some of why that is. And then afterwards, with some follow-up videos, I'll go into more of the technical details. Here we are at the Git repo, and the first thing that I want to point out is that Greenlock Express v4 is more focused on being a programmable web server, which means that Greenlock v4 is more focused on supporting that use case. And the reason for this is that I am building out some additional tools that I'm calling Greenlock Pro, as well as the thing that I'm working on long-term, which is Hub, which is a home web server, and you can check out that to learn a little bit more. And as part of that, the data and the code needed to be separated. And this is an industry standard thing, so it's not like this is, some earth-shattering revelation, but it can feel a little bit backwards, especially if your use case is not building a programmable web server, something that can be operated on via an API and it can be dynamic, but rather you're trying to embed Greenlock, So first of all, we see that the data and the code are separate. The data is now read-write, and that's why it has to be separate from the code. There's some additional metadata that wasn't there before that having it there just kind of makes things simpler, more consistent, and I get to do away with some stupid stuff. In terms of the init, just real quick, package root is basically just because of some issues between operating systems and service runners like systemd, launch control, etc., and how the working directory isn't necessarily the executable directory or the directory where the config goes. And so it just made sense this can be an absolute path, but if it's a relative path, it needs to know what it's relative to because the way that Node and NPM and those other systems work. So don't want to dive into that any further. The configure is pretty much the same as it was before, but there's also now the config file that stores more of what used to be possible to pass in here, but is not what you pass in here anymore. The maintainer email is just to be explicit that this is for a contact for security and critical bug notices for somebody who writes code, as opposed to the subscriber email or the customer email, because people used to put the customer email there, and that was the customer, they don't want security notices on the product that you're building, So anyway, that's why that changed. And you still can have a separate subscriber email, but I'm not going to cover that here because most people don't need it. Also, cluster, not really going to talk about it other than to say that if you're using PM2 or Forever or something like that is a service runner, do not turn on cluster in the service runner because Greenlock is, first of all, it needs to know some additional information in order to work with cluster, which is why there was this separate Greenlock cluster thing that eventually got out of date. And I didn't want that to get out of date anymore. So that's that. The .serve, having multiple .listens was just confusing because Express has its own .listen, and then Node has some nuanced details between the HTTP, HTTP2, and HTTPS .listens. So I just called it .serve, and this is the thing that it just sets it all up automatically. Also, with .listen, people didn't understand how the thing worked, and so they'd use different ports other than 80 and 443. So for the people that need the more complex stuff, or to do the low-level configuration, there's a .ready, and you can see examples on that. There's also a .master for people that need to do cluster stuff, and that's in the example. So if you need to do that, you know what you need to do. Yeah. Here, one thing that's more explicit is there's subject, and then there's alt names. And this is just because there's some confusion about multiple domains per server versus multiple domains per certificate. And for those people that need to know the distinction and already kind of have some of the knowledge on that, now you know what to do with alt names. And otherwise, alt names is just the same as subject for most people. Now, let's see. I'm not going to talk about the CLI yet. Very controversial, worth talking about, noting that it's not magic and that it's pretty simple in what it does. But next thing that I want to talk about, I skipped some stuff. I'm gonna go back up here. So a couple other things just to note. Greenlock, the whole system of Greenlock is now basically dependency free. So if it doesn't have external dependencies outside of its own project dependencies, so there's no more mismatching between node versions and dependencies and just all that stuff that comes with having dependencies. It's all kind of self-contained, which is cool. You don't have to worry about the staging versus production anymore. I mean, you can pretty much just start the thing out in production and you'll be fine. The staging option is still there as an environment variable, not as something that would go into code, because you wouldn't commit that it's staging. That wouldn't make sense. And you don't commit data, you commit code. So anyway, that is sorted out. So now you don't have to worry about staging and production conflicting with each other. And yeah, okay. That was the only extra thing. Next, we got the DNS01 challenges. Basically, I won't go into it too much other than to say it's a special case that for those of you that are using it, you know this. You could have a customer that's on name.com. You could have another customer on Namecheap. And for every time that you get a certificate, you need a unique instance that is to that service provider, that customer, and their credentials. And because of this, it kind of had a ripple effect where everything else operates in that way, where it can be defined at the top level, or it can be defined per site. So you can say, I want all of my DNS01 challenges to do this. Or you can say, for this specific site, I want this one, I want this one. Well, you can also do the same thing with the HTTP01 challenges and the key insert storage, although it doesn't make as much sense for those. It's just kind of a ripple effect where it goes up the chain. And this is also having this be consistent with the CLI and API is why these callbacks need to go in a file rather than just being in the init. So that just to kind of explain why that is. And let's see what else we need to talk about. Let's talk a little bit about the CLI, and then we'll end off with a little bit about embedding and that particular use case that the people that are most frustrated with things are kind of need to hear the most about. So the API, the CLI is not magic. Like I said, it's just copying from template files. So when you run the init, it's just copying from a template server.js and app.js and then filling in some details based on what arguments you pass it. And if you want to know more about that, you can run npx init -help and it'll spit out a bunch of stuff. And if you want to know, like, how's the config file for this or that or the other, really the best way to do it is just to run the CLI for that operation and pass --help and then run it with whatever options and then open up the config file. But don't dynamically or programmatically edit the config file, because that's what the manager is for. And there's just 2 callbacks that you need to implement. So it's not like a big deal. And then it's going to handle it correctly. And then it'll work whether it's, files or database or whatever. So keep that in mind. Let's see. Yeah, that's the same stuff we already talked about. Yeah, so really, I mean, you can edit this by hand for onesie twosie stuff, but if you're doing it dynamically or programmatically, don't edit it by hand. Use the API, which is it's almost in perfect parity with the CLI, and that's documented in the Greenlock repository. So if you just get rid of the -express, that's where the API is documented, and you create an instance of Greenlock very similarly to how you create an instance of Greenlock Express, except there's no cluster, but you basically just take this object and you pass it, and then you get something that you can run simultaneously with Greenlock Express. And then the particular case of embedding Greenlock. So Greenlock is meant to be that you use Greenlock to run your application. So, you require your app.js and Greenlock runs it. For those of you that are doing the inverse, where you're taking, you're building a web server that's not intended to be programmable. It's not something where there's going to be an API that interacts with it, or it can update on the fly. It's more of a static configuration, like Apache or Nginx, just done in Node. Then you need to write 2 callbacks. That's the way it is. So sorry if you didn't like that. That's just how it is. You need to write your management callbacks for retrieving the list of domains and data about them, and for writing the domains and data about them. And that will be the next video. I hope that that video was useful for you. If it was, please give it a thumbs up, and you can subscribe if you'd like to follow more tutorials on Greenlock and other root projects. If you have any comments or questions, rather than using the comments below, if you look in the description, there's a link to the Git issues. And that is a better place for more focused questions. Perhaps general discussion could go here, that would be fine. I hope that helped, and good luck on your projects.